We may even have a space force.
When President Trump first mentioned the idea of creating a space force in March 2018, it caught many by surprise.
You know, I was saying it the other day because we're doing a tremendous amount of work in space. I said, maybe we need a new force. We'll call it the Space Force. And I was not really serious. And then I said, what a great idea. Maybe we'll have to do that.
It sounded to many like a random, off-the-cuff idea, and it provided great fodder for late-night comedians.
The president said he wants to create a new branch of the military that would patrol outer space. And get this, he wants to call it
Space Force!
Space Force! It sounds like what my grandma calls Star Wars.
But behind the scenes, the Trump administration was tapping into a debate that had been simmering for more than 2 decades. He just happened to bring it to the forefront of the public discourse for the first time. The idea of warfare in space dates back to the beginning of the space age. After the launch of Sputnik in 1957, American and Soviet engineers went to work developing weapons that could defeat satellites. The first anti-satellite test was conducted in 1959. An American B-47 bomber launched a bold Orion missile at a defunct U.S. satellite. In the quest for military superiority, the United States became a leader in space technology.
That lead was built up within the late 50s and early 60s when we separated space within the DoD within the nation into 3 separate categories of space. We had civil space, which is the most obvious part of space, which is NASA. We had Department of Defense space, which was mostly focused on nuclear warfighting at the time. And then we had a national intelligence side of space. And each of them were their own cadre of people. But they interchanged a lot. The amazing thing we did is we created these giants in space, who most of us revere today, who understood the technology, the doctrine, and the strategy of space, and could execute it across any of those 3 organizations.
In the wake of the first Gulf War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the way the military used space began to change.
Through space forces, that helps us command and control our conventional forces around the world. It provides our conventional forces intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. And furthermore, it allows us to place precision-guided munitions on potential targets. I would argue it is essential. And that's one of the reasons why Russia and China are developing a full range of anti-satellite systems. They understand how dependent our conventional forces are on outer space-derived data, and they are developing capabilities to deny us access to that information.
We started to go ahead after the end of the Cold War. We lost that singular focus from the Office of Secretary of Defense. We put in place personnel structures within our Department of Defense space activities that actually inhibited the kind of growth that we had early in the space age.
Congress became concerned about how the national security space enterprise was organized to meet these new challenges, and some began discussing whether a new military service might be necessary. So in 1999, Congress created what became known as the Rumsfeld Commission to study the issue. General Fogelman was one of the commissioners.
Like any of these things, after it bubbles and boils a while, the Congress gets engaged in it, and so they wanted an independent outside group, but yet group of knowledgeable people to address this whole idea of organization and management of national security space. I mean, that was really what we were supposed to get together and do. You know, Secretary Rumsfeld was chosen to lead this effort.
Congress tasked the commission with assessing the costs and benefits of establishing an independent military department for space and a Space Corps within the Air Force.
They also addressed this issue about whether or not the Air Force was capable of fostering the development, the professional development of the human beings that are involved in space, and whether the Air Force was capable of really fostering the growth of doctrine and concepts and tactics, techniques, and procedures and other things.
In January 2001, the Rumsfeld Commission issued its final report to Congress.
We pretty well came down, I think, on the idea that in the not too distant future, we may have a Space Corps, but it'll probably be like the Marine-Navy relationship with the Air Force. That was about as far as the Rumsfeld Commission was, kind of willing to go with the thing. Then 9/11 happened, and so I think the focus on the recommendations coming out of the Rumsfeld Commission were just kind of lost.
We waited for years for the Air Force to take appropriate action on its own. It really looked like the Pentagon was going backwards because, ironically enough, the Pentagon had a space command from about 1985 to 2002. Then in the Iraq and Afghan wars, we started not paying as much attention to our space assets.
In 2006, Congress ordered a new independent review of the National Security Space Enterprise, what became known as the Allard Commission. But before the commission had finished its work, China shocked the world with an unannounced destructive anti-satellite test in January 2007.
As a result of that test, there have been thousands of incidents where pieces of debris from that test have come close to China's own satellite, putting their satellite at risk.
The timelines in space are very short. It's very difficult to know when something went wrong, why it went wrong.
Nations like China started launching ASAT missiles that could destroy virtually any satellite above our heads, and we just sat on our hands. In fact, we allowed space R&D budgets to go down.
So what Russia and China are doing, it's not like they're doing things we cannot do. It's just the fact that they are now doing it.
In 2008, the Allard Commission finished its work and issued its report to Congress. General Fogelman was the only person to serve as a commissioner on both the Rumsfeld and Allard Commissions.
So in the Allard Commission, we kind of focused on how could we come up with a single organization that would have requirements authority, acquisition authority, the oversight of production, the fielding. How could we do that? And we came up with this idea that what you really needed was an Undersecretary of Defense for Space. The other thing the Allard Commission was very, very strong on was on the requirement to have somebody responsible for the training of space experts, whether they were in the intel community or they were going to be space operators, this sort of thing.
If you take the Rumsfeld Commission, the Allard Commission, and all of the others, if I had to translate today what the problems are, I would say we have three basic problems today. One is a warfighting readiness problem, and I believe that is the major problem that we have. We are not ready to fight a conflict that either begins in or extends into space. We're also, I think, we have a problem with unity of effort. What Rumsfeld would have called seams exists today. It exists operationally, and it exists in the preparation of our forces and capabilities to be able to fight in the kind of environment we're going to find ourselves in today. And then third, I think we have maybe a capabilities issue. I think those are the three problems that if I had to define the problems to go solve, those are the three.
But following the Allard Commission report, little changed within the Department of Defense in terms of how national security space was organized. By the spring of 2017, some members of Congress were ready to take action.
The culture of the Air Force remained the same, much more focused on fighter jocks and leather jackets, and than on a space cadre that could really do the job and keep up with the advances made in other nations. So we thought after 8 or 10 years of waiting on the Air Force to do something that we'd prod them a little bit to take stronger action. Mike Rogers and I came up with a bipartisan proposal. It passed the House Armed Services Committee overwhelmingly. It was received somewhat reluctantly by the Senate, but it was included in the National Defense Authorization Bill to start creating a separate group of space professionals within the Department of Air Force, kind of like the Marine Corps is in the Department of the Navy, but people whose job, whose career, whose promotion opportunities would be centered on space excellence. That's what we were looking for.
The Air Force argued against creating a Space Corps. Air Force Secretary Heather Wilson told reporters, quote, "This will make it more complex, add more boxes to the organization chart, and cost more money," end quote. The Space Corps proposal ultimately did not pass the Senate in 2017, but the idea got a second chance in 2018 from an unexpected supporter.
Very importantly, I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the sixth branch of the armed forces.
Certainly I was surprised. I have never heard a president of the United States mention a Space Force before, and it had an interesting impact to the overall debate.
Space Force. Space Force.
It sounds fantastic and fanciful, and clearly people, you want to know what's the uniform, and, is there a band that goes with the new branch of the military?
We are going to have the Air Force, and we are going to have the Space Force, separate but equal.
I think a lot of people anticipated it'd be something like Starship Troopers, in that we're going to have guys parachuting out of satellites. I don't even know how that would work. But I think that's what the thinking is. Or they're thinking it's a suddenly huge change in the United States, and we're shifting to suddenly having a national security space capability. And a lot of it is just people don't know. They don't know that the U.S. military has been involved in space from the beginning of the space age. They don't know that it's part of our enabling for how our national security establishment works. And they don't understand what exactly is being promoted. And to be fair, a lot of that is because the branding has been terrible on the Space Force.
As their actions make clear, our adversaries have transformed space into a warfighting domain already. And the United States will not shrink from this challenge.
I think the idea behind the Space Force is that it would be able to more accurately put U.S. national security capabilities in space into one key place and really push for it, as opposed to having it be up to the United States Air Force, which frankly is still very airplane-centric.
What the Trump administration ended up proposing to Congress in 2019 is not a separate department as the president had first suggested. Instead, it ended up proposing a separate service that would remain under the Department of the Air Force, much like the Marine Corps falls under the Department of the Navy. This proposal is similar to the Space Corps proposal Congress considered in 2017. Importantly, the Space Force would not include space organizations or activities from the National Reconnaissance Office or other intelligence agencies. The military, Congress, and outside experts remain divided on the best way to proceed.
We've been chasing something for well over 20 years in space organizationally that I think does not have an organizational solution. I believe that if the space missions remain with the Air Force, changes have to be made. I could embrace a Space Corps if it was structured correctly. I'm not sure that the Marine Corps model is exactly right.
So I used to say, today we are an Air and Space Force, but we are moving towards being an Air and Space Force, and we will eventually become a Space and Air Force. I think the idea that you're going to try to put together a national Space Force or a Space Force that excludes the intel community is folly. You can't do that. I just don't think you can do that.
We should not be making decisions like this on the fly.
If you would carry that assignment out, I would be very greatly honored also. Where's General Dunford? General? Got it? Let's go get it, General.
We need a robust national debate to examine the pros and cons of such an important decision. Because the last thing we want to do is make rash decisions today and 5 years from now have to rethink and rejigger the entire organization.
The biggest misconception is this was a wild idea that came out of the mind of the president and has no basis in reality. And that's just wrong. I mean, the fact of the matter is this is a well-argued question that has taken the times of Secretary of Defenses and heads of armed service committees over the last 25 years.
In previous incarnations, this was really discussing reorganizing what already existed. And there's bits of space in a number of different military branches. And the idea that you would not only call it Space Force, you'd be elevating this to another military branch. It has the effect with the language, but you also need to be thinking carefully about bureaucracy.
So I think China, I think it depends on the translation, but I think they already do have something that's very close to a Space Force. The Russians, they're kind of all over the place in terms of what they do for their military space capabilities. But I think there is definitely probably an interest in having the ability to play to their own domestic audiences, that they are keeping up with the United States.
I often tell people, hands down, the U.S. has the best Air Force in the world. We should ask ourselves, would that be the case if the Air Force was still subjugated to the Army? And the likelihood is that it probably would not be. People need to understand that military space is critically important to everything the U.S. military does, and that we will lose soldiers, sailors, and airmen. We will lose lives without the use of space for the advantage of the military. We will lose lives of non-combatants without the use of space for the military. We will lose lives of our adversaries that are unnecessary to be lost.
Ultimately, Congress will determine the fate of the Space Force.
I haven't met anybody yet who hasn't been to the briefings who doesn't agree with this, that we need to enhance space capability in America. And we can't just turn it over to folks who love to pilot fighter jets. So I think there's a huge bipartisan consensus here. It's a question of working it through the system.
You've said enough. Let's sign. Let's sign.
In the history of the stand-up or not stand-up of the U.S. Space Forces, people are looking for a Billy Mitchell or a Hap Arnold. That person may not exist. It may never exist. I want folks to understand that this is not a singular individual's crusade. This is a group of individuals from all political persuasions who have come together to try to create something for the nation.